Hi again, everyone. We've had heaps of action on the e-lending project since we last spoke about it at the ADA forum. So we wanted to give you an update today and some of the key results. And some of you who've heard about this will remember that the reason why we're interested in e-lending is ultimately because ebooks and physical books are regulated really differently. So libraries can buy and lend physical copies without having to get anybody's permission. But for ebooks, acquiring and lending, of course, involves the making of copies and transmissions, which means that copyright law gets involved. So now, over these works, publishers do have the right to require permission. And it gives them unprecedented rights to control library uses. Some publishers have exercised those rights by imposing new limits, so licensing books, for example, for 26 checkouts and saying after that they're worn out and they get deleted from the collection and you buy another one. Other publishers have refused to license their books to libraries on any terms at all. Nobody sat down and made any deliberate decision to regulate ebooks differently to physical ones. It's just a consequence that flows from the nature of digital. But that different treatment, of course, raises questions that go right to the heart of libraryship and questions about what does it mean for libraries' abilities to fulfil their public interest missions. And that's what our team of researchers has been working on with the help of library organisations within Australia and overseas as well. So today, 4 quick-fire findings from our work to date. We're going to also show you how you can explore this data yourselves and let you know what we're going to be doing next. So before we jump into what we found, just a brief word on terminology. We categorise the licenses we talk about here according to 2 lending models. So there's the one copy, one user lending model, which is a perpetual license for as long as the library has access to the material, to the platform, and it can be borrowed by one user at a time. And then there are metered access licenses as well. They can still only be borrowed by one user at a time, but then there are additional limits on top of that. So they might be metered by a number of checkouts, they might be limited by a period of time, or it might be both. So, very common to see a licence in Australia that lasts for 2 years or 36 loans, whichever comes first. And after that, it's deleted from the collection. And we call those time-limited licenses exploding licenses because as soon as that time comes up, they're deleted from the collection, even if nobody's ever borrowed them at all. All right, so what did we find out? We've done a whole bunch of studies looking within Australia at every single aggregator, looking across 5 different countries for those same books, and then an enormous study looking at almost 100,000 different books, their relative availability across 5 English-speaking countries, the terms of the access to those books, and the prices in each country. So the first finding is that books are missing. So if we start with those smaller studies we did of culturally valuable books, we saw that books were missing in Australia at rates between 29 and 38%, depending on which aggregator that you were looking at. And now that was a bit sadly, that was much better than we'd been warned to expect. Our library partners, particularly, sort of around 2013, 2014, we started putting this together. There was less access to the backlist than we've got now. But it's still, considerably worse than the physical availability, which for these same books was only 6% of them were missing in physical form. Then we can see when we look at our larger study of almost 100,000 books, there was almost 20,000 of them that were available in either the US, Canada, or the UK that were missing in Australia and New Zealand. So of those, it was 94,000 books in the end. Almost 20,000 were missing in Australia and New Zealand. Lots of the missing books came from Hachette, the world's 3rd largest trade and educational publisher. In the large-scale study, Hachette made available almost 1,500 books in the US, almost 1,400 in Canada. How many in Australia, New Zealand, and the UK? So that's because Hachette's various offices have different policies around library use of their ebooks, And in Commonwealth countries, they still refuse to license books to libraries on any terms at all. And so these 16 books, they were actually Hachette titles from imprints that had only recently been acquired, and by now those ones are no doubt missing as well.
It is important, however, to note that we found some really quite hopeful signs. Rebecca has already referred to the fact that availability overall was actually better than we expected from talking to libraries initially. One thing that gives us some room for hope was that we did mention that 6% of the books couldn't be purchased in physical form by libraries. Interestingly, we found that 50% of those were available for e-lending, which indicates that ebooks are playing a role in continued cultural availability of books that otherwise might not be available at all. So that's a hopeful thing. Another relatively hopeful sign that we found, we kind of expected to see difficulties with backlist, particularly books that would have been not born digital. But we actually found quite a lot of availability going way back in time. So this is important too. From a library perspective, libraries have long played a really important role in ensuring that culturally significant books continue to be available, especially after they've gone out of print and especially after they've disappeared from bookstore shelves, which they often do within a couple of years, if not sooner. So it's really encouraging to see that so many of the older books were being made available in ebook form.
A bit less hopeful though, now that takes us straight to one of our most important findings, which is that even where ebooks are available, they are not necessarily accessible. And again, we can see this most clearly with those older titles. We all know that books depreciate quickly. Most of them have a commercial life of less than 5 years. And we wanted to understand how that lower demand for older books was being reflected in the terms on which publishers license them to libraries. And what we discovered is that it is not one little bit. What we found was that older books are being licensed and priced on the same kinds of terms as the very newest, most in-demand books. All right, so we're seeing these older, less demanded titles being made available on those exploding licenses, that see them deleted from the collection after 1 or 2 years, and for just as high a price as a brand new release. And we're concerned that that makes it unfeasible for public libraries to hold certain kinds of books in their collections at all, and indeed exactly the kinds of books that it has long been libraries' mission to continue to make available. And so that's what we mean when we say that books can be available without necessarily being accessible. That this kind of term might be threatening the ability of public libraries to play that role in ensuring continued cultural availability.
Now, the fourth finding we want to highlight for you is that just to draw on a theme from today, there's a really strong case for transparency here in data. One of the things that we tracked in this work was trying to look at, say, differences between licenses and prices across platforms. And the really interesting thing is, of course, when we were originally designing the work, the aggregators were telling us, well, you don't need to do that because the publishers offer the same terms to every platform. So we were told there was nothing to see, it would all be very uninteresting, we wouldn't find any differences. You can see where this is leading, right? There was definitely something to see. In fact, we discovered that something like 41% of the titles we looked at were on different terms on the different platforms. Right? So different lending models. You might find OCOU on one and metered on another. As you can see, in 22% of those cases, it was a major difference. The other thing we noticed that pricing was all over the place. So that the same book could be available from different platforms at different price points. That is not something we expected to see because we were told that definitely wouldn't happen. This was a huge surprise to aggregators too, who thought they were getting the same terms from the publishers, who found that in fact they were not. So that told us a couple of things. One is that whatever their intention is, and we assume that it is in fact publishers' intention to give the same terms to different aggregators, they're not very good at doing that. So there's that, and even the aggregators really don't always know what's going on. And so what this is telling us is that there is a really strong case for this kind of transparency and data, because otherwise no one knows what's going on. So that's 4 quick lessons from the work that we've done so far. This is all based on a really big data set and really rigorous work that's taken us a good couple of years to do effectively. So books are missing. There are some hopeful signs, and perhaps most importantly, ebooks can be available without being accessible in the way that you'd like. The new data sets we put together are really, really rich sources of information about what is going on in this space. We have only scratched the surface with the work that we've already done. So, a central mission has been to make sure that the data is as open and accessible as possible.
So I do hope that we have some data geeks in the audience here, but this is hopefully for all of you to appreciate. We wanted everyone to be able to manipulate this data and grapple with it, even if you haven't got any training in database use. And so to facilitate that, we've created a series of interactive dashboards that allow any one of you to visually query this data. So if you go to elendingproject.org, you'll see them come up. And all you have to do is just select the characteristics that you're interested in, and then the dashboard will update live to show you that subset of the data. So we're going to do a really quick demo here. So one example, using the dashboard that's powered by our large-scale data set of 100,000 books. So let's say you're interested only in the most recent books in our sample, so you would just use the slider to select them as you see, and then the dashboard immediately updates to show you the characteristics of those books. And then say you want to drill down to only the books that are available in all 5 countries that we look at. So you just choose available everywhere. Then if we scroll back up, we see that our selected books, the recent titles available in all 5 countries, are split around 50-50, published by the Big 5 and by other publishers in all 5 countries. Then we might like to filter further to just that subset of books that sometimes has a different license across jurisdictions. And that significantly changes the publisher mix. We see those recent books available in all 5 countries, but with license differences across countries, are almost universally published by the Big 5. So then we can scroll down and see, well, what does that license mix look like in the different countries? And we can find the answer in the lending model chart. So for our selected books, we're seeing much more one copy, one user in Australia and New Zealand, and then more metered access in the other countries. We also see key differences in the kind of metered license that you've got in the different places. So the UK, Canada and the US have much more of the metered by loans only, but with no time limit, whereas we've got a lot more of those exploding licenses in Australia and New Zealand. And then whenever you found something that you're interested in, you can always download that data, either the full data set or just your selected data based on your query, and play around with it as a CSV file further. So what we've done is we've created different dashboards for the 3 major studies that we've done. They're on our website. We've also put up there our first 2 scientific papers for those of you who want to dig a little bit deeper. They've both been accepted for publication in the leading open access journal Information Research, but you can check out the advanced copies now, and there's heaps of cool stuff in there. If I geek out a little bit, we had so much fun with this, but we did things like we wrote an algorithm to figure out, well, what is the original year that these books were published, because that's something that we couldn't get from our other data, so we estimated that. We used machine learning to figure out how publishers set prices, because we wanted to know, okay, we've done this analysis and we can't really figure out the relationship between price, what libraries actually get in exchange for their money, like the kind of license they get, what country it's available in, how old the book is. So we use machine learning to learn the relationships between price and these other features. Spoiler alert, there isn't one. These prices are set entirely at the whim of publishers without reference to any other characteristic of the book at all, which I think is really incredible. So do please check it out. We've also got some other accessible materials on the site if you want to share them within your organisation. But please do have a play with the dashboards, because they're our babies and we love them, and it's super fun.
So the what next? The next step for us in the project is that we've done a survey of people in libraries who procure ebooks for libraries and who choose them?
Public libraries.
Public libraries, sorry, to find out how these practices are actually impacting on library decision making. That will be the last piece of the evidence base we need, and then we get to move on to the law, policy, practice analysis, trying to work out what it all means and how we might change things to make things better. In the meantime, our data and analysis is already being used by the Department of Communications and the Arts Public Lending Rights team to help figure out how the public lending right might be extended to ebooks.
Hi. Well, we hope you're still using it.
We hope you're using it. And also by IFLA in its conversations with publishers about their practices. We're also hoping it can be used to inform some of these discussions about whether authors are being properly paid by publishers for library ebook licences. So that's the whistle-stop tour of what we're doing. We have a glossy pamphlet. Some of you may already have picked one up because we had some outside, which is a summary of some of the key results. If you've missed out and haven't got a copy yet, I still have a few down the front here. It's also downloadable from the website, so send links to your friends. And if you want to dig deeper, we've got videos of the IFLA keynote that Rebecca gave, available from the website and the scientific papers. And there's a Twitter account, eLending Project, so do interact with us. Thank you.